I remember the very first time I had to preach from this text in Dr. Henning's day. I went through that and said just about precisely that. And afterwards, he came up to me after we'd said the creed, and he said to me, when you were saying that, I was looking around the room and I thought, who are we talking about here? I'm going to make a name for myself. How do I make a name for myself? Well, I live at, come by and see my mud brick palace. But now, we turn to the story of Abram, and what is said to him is, right off the bat, leave your land, leave your father's house for a land that I will show you. The land is unnamed, and what you're supposed to do is leave behind all of those sources of support and comfort that you've known, and trust me. And that's the very essence of what faith is. Faith means I tuck my hand into the hand of God, and we go out into the future together. That's the basic idea, but there's a secondary clause to all of this, and that is, how do people live who are people of faith? How do people live who put their trust in God? What would it look like? And what would it not look like? And Abraham is a splendid example of both. He'll show you what it looks like, and he will show you what it doesn't look like. I'm always reminded of an incident that occurred in 1939. Many of you will remember this well. It was December 1939. I was 8 years old. And for the first time, they had decided that the king would make a broadcast to the Commonwealth. And since my parents were thoroughgoing royalists, on Christmas Day, we didn't start with Santa Claus or opening gifts or a special breakfast or singing carols or reading the New Testament. Instead of that, we all gathered around the radio in the kitchen to listen. So, big band sounds, God Save the King. We all stand up because my parents were that sort. And then, this is London calling, and the king spoke. He concluded his remarks with this quote from an obscure British poetess. I think her name was Haskins. I think that's right. But the part of it that he quotes is this: I said to a man who stood at the gate of the year, give me a light that I may tread safely in the future. And he replied, go out into the darkness and put your hand into the hand of God, and that shall be to you better than a light and safer than the known way. Put your hand into the hand of God, go out into the darkness and trust. That's the essence of faith. That's what it looks like. It's basically finding your security in God and in God alone. Because that's the only place where you really are secure. Then, how do I live in the light of that? Do I just sit around holding on to God's hand? Well, no, not from the vantage point of the Abraham stories. There are certain things that follow from that. But initially, he does that, and there are certain promises attached to it. You run the risk of faith, and I'll give you a name. They were looking for a name. You want a name? Then trust God. You'll get a name. Because again, in Hebrew, to have a name means to exist. Not to have a name means not to exist. So existence comes from faith. Existence does not come from big mud brick towers. They come and they go. Existence comes from faith. And so the text says, and this is really surprising, Abram went forth as God had commanded him. Abraham was 75 years old. She was 10 years younger. And so the two of them go off together. This is really foolish, isn't it? Wouldn't you say so? Yes, you would. Those of you who know something about that age bracket would say, you're not going to do that. That's crazy. Here I am, I'm very comfortably ensconced right here. Why would I do that? Well, you could only do it if your hand was tucked into the hand of God. If it's entirely, my hand is tucked into my own hand, then that's different. Because I know that that's not really very secure. It's not secure at all, as a matter of fact, and so I wouldn't want to run the risk. They do it, and they go from Haran, and now Haran is up roughly in Kurdistan, right on the Syrian-Turkish border today. They make the trek from Haran to Aleppo, and from Aleppo to Damascus, and then down around the Sea of Galilee, and right up the hill country of Samaria first, and then on down south. But first of all, they get to Shechem, which is right in the middle of the country, and God says to him, I will assign this land to your offspring. So this is the land, I'm going to give it to you. So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. And then he moved south from Shechem to Bethel, which is just to the north of Jerusalem. I was involved in excavations at Ai for a couple of years, and Ai and Bethel are closely joined, and you could see Jerusalem's towers from Ai. And Bethel and Ai are very close to Jerusalem. But he doesn't go to Jerusalem because Jerusalem was a Canaanite city forevermore until the days of David. So when he makes his trek up and down the highlands, he bypasses Jerusalem each time, if you follow the text at all. Now, he goes south of Hebron, and comes down to the Negev. Well, the Negev is not a very attractive part of the world. And he's there a little while, and there's a famine. He's in the Promised Land, but there's a famine in the Promised Land. Many of you have experienced this. Do you understand what I'm talking about? You find a famine in the Promised Land, you say, this is not going to do. I'm going to go to Egypt. Because I know there won't be any famine in Egypt. And also, of course, in the process of going to Egypt, I'm going to let go of this hand. And I'm going to take charge of my own life by myself. And so off they go to Egypt. As he gets close to the border of Egypt, he realizes he's going to have a serious problem. This 65-year-old wife of his is extremely beautiful. He knows she's very beautiful. I've never met a guy 75 who didn't think his wife was really beautiful. She doesn't think so. He does. They get to the border of Egypt, and he's now afraid. Because, of course, when you trust only yourself, paranoia begins to sneak in. He says to her, look, you know what's going to happen when we get to Egypt? These Egyptians are going to see you, and they're going to be so startled by your beauty that they'll report it to Pharaoh. And the next thing you know, you'll be in Pharaoh's harem, and I'll be dead. I want you to do me a favor. I want you to tell everybody that you're my sister. And then when we get down there, everything will work out all right, and you will, of course, have done a little bit of lying on my behalf. And so when they get to Egypt, sure enough, who is this woman? She's my sister. Wow, she's really beautiful. Do you mind? No, we don't mind. And so off she goes to Pharaoh's harem. And if it hadn't been for the Lord, God only knows what would have happened in Pharaoh's harem. You just stop and think for a second. Now, what kind of a man is Abram? What do you think of him? Nothing is said in the text about Sarah's response to this. Not a word. She just goes along with it. Once I asked a group of ladies in this church what they thought Sarah was thinking, and one of them said, what I draw from this is that when you hit 65, the first thing you ought to do is go to Egypt. Now that really wasn't what I was looking for, but that's what I got. He wasn't going to trust the future to God, and everything is put in jeopardy, particularly his own relationship with this singularly important woman. He has to lie and he has to cheat. And if it hadn't been for the Lord, as I said, who knows what would have happened, but the Lord extricates him from the situation, and Pharaoh appoints, well, a platoon of soldiers, really, to all intents and purposes, and they escort him out. We don't need you here. Man of faith, you're a riffraff. Get going. Now, as I said to you, he is iconic. He is a man of faith, and a man of faith will put his trust in the Lord. But you know yourselves that people of faith are not always consistent, or some of them aren't. And he's not consistent. And when he's inconsistent, then he gets himself into some serious trouble. But now back he goes to the Negev, and then moves north again to Bethel and Ai, just north of Jerusalem. He and Lot go together, and they're very, very wealthy, because he's made a lot of money in Egypt. I don't know exactly how you'd describe his role with regard to Sarah, but whatever you'd say about it, he makes a lot of money out of it. He's very wealthy. And when he gets back to Bethel and Ai, Lot, who's gone with him, has also become very wealthy, and the two of them have extended holdings. Lots of sheep, lots of goats, lots of shepherds working for them, and pretty soon they're fighting over land rights. And I suppose water rights as well, but in any case they're squabbling. And Abraham now says to Lot, look, the whole land is here in front of us. I don't like our squabbling, so I tell you what, you can have any part of it you want. You go east, I'll go west. You go north, I'll go south. You just take whatever it is that you want. And Lot looks around, and actually, this is kind of hard to do from my experience at Bethel and Ai, but I suppose you could figure out a way of doing it. But Lot looks down into the Jordan Valley. Now, that's a different story from the highlands of Palestine, because the highlands of Palestine are not really very attractive. I never did see any milk or honey flowing anywhere there. But down in the Jordan Valley around Jericho, which is an immense oasis, it really looks pretty. It's nice. So Lot says, I'll take that. And Abraham said, fine. And off Lot went. This was a bad choice. On the surface of it, it looks like a really good choice. So immediate results. He goes, Abraham stays in the hill country. Again, now you'd ask yourself the question, what does a man of faith act like? And the answer is, a man of faith is someone who can run the risk of being generous. You run the risk of being generous. I can't give. I'll be in the poorhouse if I give. And he might have been. But he ran the risk of giving, and he did not end up in the poorhouse at all. Quite the contrary. God came to him again and said to him, now I reaffirm my previous oath to you. This is your land. And that story ends that way. When he is afraid, he gets into trouble. But when he runs the risk of being a man of faith, quite the opposite occurs. Now, there's a very strange story which follows, and it is interesting to read the commentaries and read the historians on this, because they've never been able to make much out of it. But the long and the short of it, and then I'll just summarize it, is there were raiding tribes from the desert round about, from all over the place, and they came across the desert, and they began to attack the tribal groups that were on the east side of the Jordan. So today that would be up in the highlands of Transjordan, first of all. And they came sweeping down through that area and knocking off all the other little tribes, raiding them and stealing everything they had. And then eventually they moved on down into the Jordan Valley. And they raided Sodom and Gomorrah, and they defeated them. And Lot had made the unfortunate choice of living down there. And so they got Lot too. And they took Lot away as a prisoner with all of the people who worked for him, and they took everything that Lot had accumulated, and away they went. They went north, right on up the Jordan Valley, all the way up to Damascus, and even north of Damascus. Now, someone came and reported to Abraham that this had happened. That these raiders had stolen everything that Lot had and Lot too. They're a massive group, very powerful. So what does Abram do? Well, now this is going to be an example again of the man of faith in action. He gets together his group, and by comparison they're small, but up the Jordan Valley they go, past Damascus to where these raiders are, and then at night they attack them. And they disperse the whole lot of them. And they rescue Lot and all of the people who were associated with him, and they bring back a much larger body of loot than they ever had, and they bring it back down the Jordan Valley. Now, two incidents occur that I think are really rather interesting. The first is, when they get back down there, the king of Sodom came out to meet Abram in the valley of Shaveh. And he said to Abram, "Give me the people, and you take all the loot for yourself." But Abram said to the king of Sodom, "I swear by the Lord God Most High, the creator of heaven and earth, I will not take so much as the thread or a sandal strap of what is yours. No one will ever say that it was I who made Abram rich. For me, nothing but what my servants have, or maybe what some of my associates have taken, you can have all the rest." See, here comes the generous man in action. But not just the generous man. This is a courageous man. He's willing to run the risk for the sake of Lot. But then on top of that, a very mysterious event occurs. There is a priest in Jerusalem whose name is Melchizedek. Occurs every now and again in the Bible. And Melchizedek comes out to Abram with some bread and some wine. And he blessed Abram, saying, "Blessed be Abram of God Most High, the creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered you from your foes and delivered them into your hand." And then you get the magic statement. So Abraham gave him a tithe. Okay? So now I'm asking myself the question, Abram is an icon. How does he act? Well, icons are courageous. Icons are very willing to help those who are members of the brotherhood. They will go to great extent to help them out, as with Lot, for example. And they're very generous. And they tithe. Or at least, they give a tenth of what they have to the clergy in Jerusalem. This is an important distinction. So it doesn't say they'll give a tenth of everything they've got to the clergy in Dallas. I mean, this is the case. They gave 10% to the clergy in Jerusalem. Now, this is the time of the year when we're talking about stewardship. So I thought to myself, this is a wonderful opportunity to say something about tithing. So I will. You don't need to leave. Way back in the 1960s, the bishops of the Methodist Church had a conflab here in Dallas at Highland Park Methodist Church, writing into the discipline a requirement that Methodists tithe. And so, in order to enhance their preparations, they requested at Perkins School of Theology that one of the faculty members from the Department of New Testament and one from the Old Testament come over and make presentations on tithing. And since I was the junior member of the Old Testament department, I was given this privilege. Well, to tell you the truth, I never thought about it. You know, I had no idea what was there, and I was quite surprised and shocked to find out what it was that was there. Actually, there are 3 tithes. Not just one. There are three. The first one is listed in Deuteronomy. As I get older, I have a problem with seeing. You know what I mean? And so here I am. I thought I could be able to see this, but I can't always see what I'm supposed to be able to see. The first one is from Deuteronomy 14. I know that well enough because I've been over this before. Now this is going to surprise you, because the first one basically is this. Every year, you are to take 10% of what you've got and go to Jerusalem and have a big feast in Jerusalem. And I thought, this is a great idea. And I would be glad to do that for St. Michael's. I would have volunteered to do that. I just stayed over there, and you all could have come in groups, and we could have had a wonderful time in Jerusalem. And I think I would have done pretty well if I had got you all to bring 10% of what you had. I mean, I don't think I would have starved. But here's what it says. You shall set aside every year a 10th part of all the yield of your sowing that is brought from the field. And you shall consume the tithes of your new grain and wine and oil and the firstlings of your herds and flocks in the presence of the Lord your God in the place where he will choose to establish his name, so that you may learn to revere the Lord your God forever. Should the distance be too great for you, should you be unable to transport them, because the place where the Lord your God has chosen to establish his name is far from you, and because the Lord your God has blessed you, you may convert them into money. Wrap up the money and take it with you to the place that the Lord your God has chosen, and spend the money on anything you want, on cattle, sheep, wine, or other intoxicants, or anything you may desire. And you shall feast there in the presence of the Lord your God and rejoice with your household. That's the first tithe. I had fun reading that to the Methodist bishops. I mean, I really did. Intoxicants, it says. I think, oh, that's a bit of a surprise. But anyway, that's the first tithe. The second tithe is this one. Do not neglect the local clergy in your community. I think this is very important. It's underlined in my text. Because he doesn't own any property. No, see, there's a problem always with these biblical texts. Local clergy don't own any property. Every third year, you must bring out the full tithes of your yield for that year, but leave it within your settlements. And then the local clergy who have no hereditary portion as you have, and the stranger, actually this would be something equivalent to the green card holder, or somebody's here on a temporary visa, the fatherless and the widow in your settlements may come and eat their fill, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the enterprises that you undertake. So, year A, 10% go to Jerusalem. Year B, 10% go to Jerusalem. Year C, 10% go to Jerusalem, 10% put into local storage for the support of the poor and those who have nothing in your community. So really, if it's done on an annual basis, it's 13 1/3% per annum. But that's not the end of it. There's another one, and it's in Numbers chapter 18. You can look it up again if you like. Every year you're to bring a tithe for the support of the clergy in Jerusalem. And Abraham does this in our passage in chapter 14. So tithing, what does it mean? Well, it means 23 1/3% per annum. And I laid that out for the Methodist bishops. They decided that they weren't going to try to impose that on the Methodist church. That's a lot, 23 1/3%. But that's the story. Abraham does it, and if you're going to follow Abraham as your icon, that's what he did. Now, we come to chapter 15, and in chapter 15 of Genesis, we really come to one of the important passages as far as Christians are concerned. Clergy are more interested in chapter 14 and the tithe, but from a Christian point of view, what happens here in 15 is really matter. Sometime later, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. He said to him, "You do not need to be afraid, Abram, because I am your protector." You don't need to be afraid. These are pivotal words addressed to the person of faith. You don't need to be afraid. The opposite of faith is not unbelief. The opposite of faith is fear. Where you see fear, you know there's no faith. You can have all the belief in the world and still fear, and there's no faith. Faith means finding your security in God. If you find your security in God, then fear is chased away. You don't need to be afraid, Abram. I am your shield. And your reward shall be very great. Oh God, what can you give me, seeing that I'm childless? I've been working on my estate, and everything I own is going to go to my Syrian houseboy. And the Lord said to him, "He won't be your heir. No one but your very descendants will be your heir." And then the Lord took Abram outside and he said to him, "Look up at the sky and count the stars if you can." And he said to him, "That's how many children you're going to have. Count the stars." And then the text says, this is very important, Abraham trusted the Lord. And the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. So what is righteousness? What does the righteousness look like? The answer is, righteousness looks like trusting God. Now, the word righteousness is an interesting word, and in due course within Judaism, but actually I heard this echoed in some of the things that Dr. Cohen said. Righteousness later comes to mean charity. But that's not what it means basically. The idea of righteousness is relational. What is a right relationship with God? What would that look like? What would that look like for you? Because that's what the bottom line is in all of this anyway. It's not just simply to entertain you, but the question is, what would righteousness look like? What would a right relationship with God look like? Answer. You put your trust in God. You put your hand in God's hand and you go out into the darkness and the unknown together. That's what righteousness looks like. He put his trust in God. Now, if I had the time, what I really ought to do is read Romans chapter 4 to you. Because there you are. It's all going to be spelled out. Massive detail. What does righteousness look like? Well, righteousness looks like faith. What does faith look like? Faith means putting your trust in God and in God alone. Homework assignment. When you go home, if you look carefully, you will find the Epistle to the Romans in the New Testament. It's in the New Testament. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans. And you read it, chapter 4. Read it. See what it says. Don't read it in the King James Version. Read it in one of the more modern translations, either the New Revised Standard Version or the New English Bible or the Jerusalem Bible or the New American Bible. One of them. Read it. And get a taste of it. Faith means putting your trust in God and in God alone. That's what righteousness is. That's what it looks like. I could make a mockery of this if I wanted to, but I'll let it go. Because we do almost everything else but trust God and say that's righteousness. You know that? We do. Is this a righteous person? A righteous person is of this, of that, of this, of that. Does the righteous person put his trust or her trust in God alone? That's the only question that matters. And then you get a very odd and strange liturgy, a covenant ceremony. That reminds me of something. This again comes from not being able to see. I meant to go back for a second to Melchizedek, and so I'm going to skip back to Melchizedek. Melchizedek brought Abraham a gift. Remember? He brought him some bread and some wine. And Abraham then responded with the tithe. I should have said something about the bread and the wine and the gift. When I first went to Jordan quite a while ago, the head of the chairman of the Department of Near Eastern Languages at the University of Toronto said to me, now there are two things I don't want you to do until you've been there and you understand the culture a little bit. I don't want you to accept gifts because you don't understand the implication. And I don't want you to eat with people, again, until you understand the implications. So I thought, well, he won't tell me what this means, so I go look it up, and I went and looked it up. In a culture like an Arab culture, if you give someone a gift, you are giving them yourself. If they take it, they're taking full responsibility for it. Do you remember in Lawrence of Arabia, that may be too long ago, but there's a magic moment when Lawrence and one of those guys who was with him are eating together and they feed one another? That's a very important moment because that's the moment when the brotherhood relationship is established. When they're eating together. It's a brotherhood relationship. Binds them together. Don't do that, he said, unless you really want to be involved with that person. You eat with them, and then you're taking on the responsibility for them. I think about that when I go to the altar. Because that's what that's all about. We kneel there at the altar, and we eat together, symbolically. And most people close out that horizontal relationship. As I go to the altar and I eat with you, that means that we're brothers and sisters. I'll give you one illustration of that I've used here before, but that spoke very powerfully to me. When I was working at Jericho, the mound of ancient Jericho sat just to the south of a very large Arab refugee village. In that refugee village, there was a school which was funded by the YWCA. Their school day ended at 4 o'clock, and our work day ended at 4:30. So when the bell rang at 4 o'clock, out they came. Now, they were learning to speak English in that school, and so up the mound they'd come, and they'd gather around the various trenches where we were working, and there they'd practice their English on us. Most of it, of course, was very, very simple, as you can imagine. How are you? How old are you? What time is it? This kind of stuff. But in the group that gathered around my trench, there was one little boy who was particularly intelligent and gifted linguistically. So he knew a much more extended vocabulary, and we could have some very interesting conversations. I did. He was a nuisance, too, because unlike the people of Jericho who are fastidiously clean, he was the exception to the rule. And he would come right up close to me so I couldn't miss him. And I could always sense he was there, and then he'd want to carry on a conversation. So we had a kind of plus-minus relationship. But one Sunday morning, I went to Jericho to take the bus to Jerusalem. The town of Jericho built on a square with various trees and flowers and so on in the square. And gathered around the square all kinds of shops. It's a Sunday morning and fairly busy in the square. So I went past for a bus terminal, and I bought a ticket to Jerusalem, and I asked them when the bus was coming, when they didn't know. They didn't know when it was coming, but you could wait around, so I did. And after a little while, there he was. And he said to me, "You're going to Jerusalem on the bus?" And I wanted to say, "Look at you, idiot. Why am I standing at the bus terminal?" But I didn't say that. "Yes, I'm going to Jerusalem on the bus." "When's it leaving?" "They don't know." "I'll find out," he said. He came back out after a barrage of Arabic, and he said, "They don't know when the bus is coming. And when it does come, they're going to have to clean it and fuel it and all that kind of stuff. So we have a little bit of time. Maybe we could have a living English lab." So I said, "Okay." So we went over to the park. Now, it was pomelo season in Jericho. And the pomelos in Jericho's a magnificent citrus oasis. If you ever go, get Jericho oranges, get Jericho pomelos. Don't let the Israelis palm off stuff from Tel Aviv on you. Get them from the valley, get them from... Lot really was wise in that respect. He knew a place to go. So it was pomelo season, and we bought a pomelo. And we went into the park. Now, a pomelo is larger than a grapefruit. Very similar, but sweeter. And he got out his knife and he peeled this pomelo, and we ate the pomelo together. And he said, "You know what this means, don't you?" And I thought, yeah. So I said, no. So what does it mean? He said, "Don't you know what it means for people to eat together in our culture?" I said, "No, what does it mean? Tell me." He said, "Well, in our culture, when people eat together, they're saying to one another, we're brothers." "What does that mean?" I asked. He said, "Well, that means that if you're ever alone or afraid, or if you're in trouble, or if you're hungry, or if you just want somebody to talk to, my door will always be open." So we eat together. What does it mean? What does it mean? We're brothers and sisters. What does that mean? That means if you're alone or afraid or in trouble, God help you. Is that what that means? Or does it mean if you're alone or afraid or in trouble, or if you just need somebody to talk to, come to me? Because I'll be glad to talk to you and I'll be glad to share with you. Is that what it means? That's what it ought to mean. And that's why my former professor, Fred Winnett, said, don't eat with them until you understand what's involved. The second thing is Melchizedek brought him a gift which Abram accepted. Now this is also dangerous. At Jericho, I had a guy work for me who was really very bright, and I liked him very much. And I used to go into the town of Jericho at night, and we'd sit around a little fire in the courtyard and drink Jericho sweet tea together, and we'd talk, and I learned what bit of Arabic I know from them. He had a daughter who, I didn't pay attention to her. She was a child as far as I was concerned. But during the course of the years that I was at Jericho, she grew up. And it got to the point where every time I would go to his house, she had a little gift for me. I, by that time, knew what that meant. So I turned her down. The parents would watch very carefully. She'd come out with her little gift. They'd be watching, and I think, now, how am I going to say no this time? Eventually, I had to stop going there altogether. Because you accept the gift, you accept the giver. "Samantha, I give you this ring. I give you this ring as a symbol of my vow, and with all that I am and all that I have, I honor you in the name of God. I give you this ring as a symbol of my vow, and with all that I am and all that I have, I honor you in the name of God." Can you hear it? I give you myself. You take this gift, you take me. Melchizedek gave Abram bread and wine. One of the things that I find heartbreaking about our liturgies, I wish in many respects that we didn't have a Eucharist. Because here we come. First of all, we're given gifts, and we give gifts. And we don't know what this means. We say, oh, do I have to put another $1 on the offering plate? The $1 on the offering plate means nothing as far as money is concerned, but it does symbolize you. I give you this gift. And when the gifts are accepted at the altar, then I'm accepted. And then I kneel at the table and I'm given gifts and I accept them. And we eat together. This ought to create a holy communion. But it's always seemed to me, maybe not. And I feel very bad about that. I used to talk about that at Perkins over and over and over again. We go through the liturgical motions, but the significance of it just slides through our fingers. Be better not to participate than not to take it seriously. Well, in the latter half of the 15th chapter of Genesis, there is a very interesting and odd covenant ceremony. It's a unilateral covenant. God binds himself to Abram. Abram doesn't have anything, Abram does not have to do anything. He's not obligated to do anything. Instead, he just prepares it. They split certain animals. And then, at the end of it all, a smoking torch passes through the animals, symbolizing God. And God makes a promise to Abraham about what he will do. And if you ask the question, what does Abraham have to do in exchange? The answer is nothing. God binds himself to Abraham. He promises him the land. And it is a unilateral agreement. It's not quid pro quo in any sense. It's not, if you do this, then I'll do that. It's strictly, I promise you that this is what I will do. And that's the end of 15. Now, let's see, it's getting kind of late, and I don't want you to miss going to church where you can celebrate together at the Eucharist. That would be a pity. But I get to the next story. It's kind of amusing in its own way, so I'll go on to it and leave you with that. Abraham has had this extraordinary experience of the presence of God, put his trust in God, and God counted that to be righteousness. And he's had this marvelous business. Look up at the sky, number the stars, and then the smoking firebrand and the covenant ceremony. And now he comes home. He's on a religious high. And he gets home. Sarah, who didn't go with him. Now this is always a mistake. Sarah should have gone with him to the Cursillo weekend or whatever it was. He didn't. She stayed at home, and while she was at home, she was thinking. And she said to him when he got home, you know, you're a nice old duck, and we've had a good time together, but the truth of the matter is you're not getting any younger, and I'm not getting any younger either. We're now aging. And the chances of our having children become, if there ever were chances, they now become extremely remote. However, I have this pretty little Egyptian housemaid named Hagar. Tell you what, you take Hagar, and if Hagar becomes pregnant, then we'll just simply adopt the child as our own, and that way we can solve the problem. Now Abraham, he's over 75 years old. He doesn't say to her, hold it, honey, just a second. I've just had this magnificent religious experience. Let me tell you about it. No, he doesn't say anything about his religious experience. Nothing about God's promise. She says, take Hagar. He says, why not? Now this is really stupid, you know. It's stupid. Stupid. If she gets pregnant, everything will be fine. Are you kidding me? You gotta be kidding. Because of course she does. Now you got these two women living with you in a small tent. The one you're married to, the other one you're not. They don't get along. Isn't that surprising? They treat one another rather badly, and after a while, Sarah gets upset. And she goes to Abraham. She said, I let you have this girl, now she's pregnant, now she's treating me like dirt. I'm going to tell God on you. And Abraham says to her, now get this, Abraham says to her, well, she's your maid, you can do with her whatever you like. Doesn't that grate on you just a little bit? Isn't that incredible? You can do whatever you like with her. And so they treat her so badly that the poor pregnant girl runs away. And if it hadn't been for God, who intervenes on her behalf, because God always has an ear open to the cry of those who are in need, whoever they may be, guilty or innocent. If it hadn't been for God, she'd have died out there in the desert. No, God comes to her help. What do you learn from that? Well, first of all, you learn that people of faith are not always consistent, but you know that anyway. But then secondly, you also know that once you start taking the future into your own hands and letting go of the hand of God, then who knows what's going to happen? And it isn't going to be good. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.